The morning sun painted the rugged mountains of eastern Afghanistan in shades of gold and brown as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her scope for the third time. She lay perfectly still on the rocky outcrop, her ghillie suit blending seamlessly with the sparse vegetation around her. The Barrett M107 rifle beside her had been her companion for over 18 months in this unforgiving terrain, and today it might become the difference between life and death for 8 American soldiers. Maria had been born in a small town in Texas, where hunting with her father had been a weekend tradition. What started as tracking deer in the hill country had evolved into something far more serious. Her natural ability with a rifle had caught the attention of military recruiters during high school, and by the age of 22, she had become one of the few female snipers deployed to Afghanistan. The radio crackled softly in her ear. "Overwatch, this is Bravo Team. We're moving into position for the intel grab. Estimated time to target, 15 minutes. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, a seasoned SEAL who had been leading missions in this region for the past 6 months. Maria pressed the transmit button twice, sending back the agreed-upon signal that she had received the message. Her position on the mountain ridge gave her a commanding view of the valley below, where a cluster of mud brick buildings housed what intelligence suggested was a high-value target. The Taliban commander they were after had been responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition forces for months. Through her scope, Maria could see the village coming to life. Women in blue burqas moved between the buildings, children played in the dusty courtyard, and men gathered around a well in the center of the settlement. It looked peaceful, almost normal, but Maria knew better. Intelligence indicated that beneath this facade of rural life lay a sophisticated enemy operation. Her spotter, Corporal James Mitchell, lay beside her with powerful binoculars. "I count 12 military-age males," he whispered. 3 on the rooftops, 2 by the main entrance, and 7 moving around the courtyard. Mitchell had been working with Maria for 8 months, and their partnership had become legendary among their unit for its precision and reliability. The SEAL team was approaching from the north, using a dried riverbed as cover. Maria tracked their movement through her scope, watching as 8 figures in desert camouflage moved with practiced stealth toward their objective. The plan was straightforward: get in, capture or eliminate the target, gather intelligence, and get out before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Maria's radio came alive again. "Overwatch. We've got eyes on the compound. Looks quiet from here, but something feels off." Morrison's voice carried the tension that experienced operators develop when their instincts start warning them of danger. Through her scope, Maria swept the area systematically. The village did seem unusually quiet for mid-morning. Usually, there would be more activity, more people moving around. She focused on the rooftops and noticed something that made her pulse quicken. One of the figures she had identified earlier was no longer visible. And there was a glint of metal from behind a low wall that hadn't been there before. "Bravo Team, this is Overwatch. I'm seeing possible hostile positioning on your eastern approach. Recommend you hold position while I confirm." Maria's voice was steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her veins. She adjusted her scope's magnification and studied the suspicious area more carefully. There, partially concealed behind a crumbling wall, she could make out the distinctive shape of a machine gun barrel. The enemy had positioned themselves to catch the SEAL team in a crossfire as they approached the main building. "Mitchell, do you see the MG position at 2 o'clock from the main building?" she whispered to her spotter. Mitchell adjusted his binoculars and nodded grimly. "Roger that. Looks like a PKM, and there's at least 2 shooters with it. This is starting to look like a trap." Maria's mind raced through the possibilities. The intelligence that had led them here might have been compromised, or the enemy might have simply been more prepared than expected. Either way, the SEAL team was walking into a potentially deadly situation. She keyed her radio again. "Bravo, team. I've confirmed hostile positions. You've got at least one machine gun emplacement covering your approach route, and possibly more that I can't see from this angle. Recommend you abort and withdraw to extraction point." There was a long pause before Morrison's voice came back. "Negative, Overwatch. This target is too important to let slip away. We're going to find another way in." Maria understood the frustration in the team leader's voice. They had been tracking this particular Taliban commander for weeks, and this might be their only chance to capture him. But her elevated position gave her a perspective that the ground team couldn't have, and what she was seeing made her increasingly uncomfortable. As she continued to observe the compound, more details became apparent. The seemingly random placement of objects around the courtyard wasn't random at all. Barrels, crates, and piles of debris had been positioned to create natural cover and concealment for defenders. The few civilians still visible were moving in patterns that suggested they knew to avoid certain areas. "I count at least 4 prepared positions now," she reported. "This is definitely a prepared ambush site. The whole thing stinks." Mitchell had been scanning other parts of the village with his binoculars. "Maria, I'm seeing movement on the ridgeline to the south. Looks like more fighters moving into position. If Bravo team goes in there, they're going to be surrounded." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had been planned as a quick snatch-and-grab operation was turning into a potential disaster. The enemy had obviously been tipped off about the raid and had prepared a warm welcome for any coalition forces that might show up. Maria's radio crackled with urgent chatter from the SEAL team. They had spotted some of the same signs she had observed and were now fully aware that they were walking into a trap. But instead of withdrawing, they were discussing alternative approaches to the target. "Overwatch, can you provide covering fire if we approach from the west side of the compound?" Morrison's question carried the weight of a leader trying to complete his mission despite overwhelming odds. Maria studied the western approach through her scope. It offered slightly better cover, but it would also put the team farther from their planned extraction route. More importantly, her position on the ridge would make it difficult to provide effective covering fire for that approach angle. "Negative on effective covering fire from my position for a western approach," she responded. "You'd be moving through my dead ground for most of the route." The morning was growing warmer, and Maria could feel sweat beginning to form under her ghillie suit. The weight of responsibility for the 8 men below was something she had carried before, but it never got easier. Every decision, every recommendation she made could mean the difference between those soldiers going home to their families or becoming casualties in this remote valley. Her scope swept across the compound one more time, looking for any detail that might provide the SEAL team with an advantage. The enemy had chosen their position well. The compound sat in a natural bowl surrounded by higher ground on 3 sides, with only one practical approach route that was now obviously covered by prepared defensive positions. "Mitchell, what's the range to that machine gun position?" she asked. Her spotter consulted his rangefinder. "Approximately 850 meters. Well within your effective range, but you'd have to expose yourself to take the shot. And there are probably more positions we haven't identified yet." 850 meters was indeed well within Maria's capabilities, but taking out one machine gun wouldn't solve the larger problem. The SEAL team would still be advancing into what appeared to be a carefully prepared killing zone with multiple defensive positions. The radio chatter continued as the team leader tried to find a viable approach to their target. Time was working against them. The longer they remained in the area, the more likely it became that additional enemy reinforcements would arrive. Local Taliban groups were known to coordinate their responses to coalition operations, and word of the American presence in the valley would spread quickly. Maria made a decision. "Bravo team, I'm going to reposition to get a better angle on the compound. Give me 10 minutes to move, then I should be able to provide better overwatch for your approach." It was a risky move. Her current position was well concealed and offered excellent fields of fire across most of the valley. Moving would expose her to potential counter-sniper fire and would temporarily leave the SEAL team without Overwatch protection. But sometimes, risks had to be taken to accomplish the mission. "Roger, Overwatch. We'll hold position until you're ready." Maria began the careful process of preparing to move. Every piece of equipment had to be secured properly to prevent noise, and her route to the new position had to be planned carefully to minimize exposure. Mitchell would remain in the current position to maintain communication with the SEAL team and provide an additional set of eyes on the compound. As she began to low crawl toward her new position, Maria reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. The little girl who had learned to shoot tin cans off fence posts in Texas was now responsible for the lives of some of America's most elite warriors. The weight of that responsibility was both humbling and motivating. The new position she had selected was approximately 200 meters to the east, on a slightly lower ridge that would give her a different angle on the compound. It would also put her closer to the action, reducing the range for potential shots, but also increasing her own exposure to enemy fire. The movement took longer than anticipated. The terrain was rougher than it had appeared from a distance, and Maria had to navigate around several areas where the ground was too loose to provide secure footing. Every step had to be deliberate and silent. 15 minutes after starting her movement, Maria was in position at her new location. The view of the compound was indeed better from this angle, and she could now see several defensive positions that had been hidden from her previous location. "Bravo, team! Overwatch is in new position. I now have visual on at least 6 prepared defensive positions around your target. This is definitely a coordinated ambush setup." The situation had gone from bad to worse. What the SEAL team was facing wasn't just a few guards around a high-value target. It was a sophisticated trap designed specifically to destroy any coalition forces that might attempt to capture or kill the Taliban commander. Morrison's voice came back tense but determined. "Understood, Overwatch. We're going to have to call this one off. Prepare to cover our withdrawal to the extraction point." It was the right decision, but Maria could hear the disappointment in the team leader's voice. Months of intelligence gathering and planning were about to result in nothing more than a wasted trip into enemy territory. But bringing 8 SEALs home alive was more important than any single target, no matter how valuable. Just as Maria was preparing to acknowledge the withdrawal order, her radio erupted with urgent voices. The situation on the ground had just changed dramatically, and the careful plans that had brought them to this point were about to become irrelevant. "Contact! Contact! We're taking fire from multiple positions." The radio exploded with Morrison's urgent voice as the carefully planned withdrawal turned into a nightmare. The Taliban fighters had initiated the ambush before the SEAL team could begin their retreat. Maria's scope immediately swung toward the compound where muzzle flashes were erupting from at least 4 different positions. The distinctive sound of AK-47 fire echoed across the valley, punctuated by the deeper, more ominous sound of the PKM machine gun she had spotted earlier. Through her scope, she could see the SEAL team scattered among the rocks and sparse vegetation of the dried riverbed, pinned down by accurate and coordinated enemy fire. The Taliban fighters had waited until the Americans were in the most vulnerable position possible before opening fire. "Overwatch, we need immediate fire support." Morrison's voice was strained as he tried to coordinate his team's response while under heavy fire. "We've got wounded and no cover." Maria's training kicked in instantly. Her scope found the machine gun position that was pouring the most devastating fire onto the SEAL team's position. The PKM gunner was partially concealed behind a low stone wall, but she could see enough of his silhouette to take a shot. "Taking the shot," she announced calmly into her radio, though her heart was pounding. She controlled her breathing, let half a breath out, and squeezed the trigger. The Barrett's powerful recoil slammed against her shoulder as the .50 caliber round crossed the 850 meters to its target in less than a second. Through her scope, she saw the machine gunner spin and fall backward. "Machine gun down," she reported, already shifting to acquire her next target. But eliminating one position wasn't enough. The remaining Taliban fighters had been well trained and disciplined. Instead of panicking when their machine gunner was hit, they increased their rate of fire and began attempting to flank the pinned SEAL team. "Multiple fighters moving on our right flank," came another urgent radio call. "We can't hold this position much longer." Maria could see the movement through her scope. At least 6 Taliban fighters were working their way along a small ravine that would allow them to get behind the SEAL team's position. Once they achieved that flanking position, the Americans would be caught in a crossfire with no escape route. Her scope tracked the lead flanking fighter, but he was moving quickly between cover positions, making a clean shot difficult. She would have to time her shot perfectly to catch him during his next movement between rocks. Meanwhile, Mitchell was coordinating with the Tactical Operations Center, calling for immediate air support. Any station, this is Overwatch. We have troops in contact and need immediate close air support. Grid reference follows." The problem was that the nearest attack aircraft were at least 20 minutes away, and the SEAL team didn't have 20 minutes. The Taliban fighters were pressing their advantage aggressively, clearly understanding that they had a limited window to destroy the American team before reinforcements arrived. Maria's radio crackled with updates from the ground team. "We've got 2 wounded, 1 serious. Petty Officer Jackson took shrapnel from an RPG that detonated close. We need to get him out of here now." The mention of casualties added urgency to an already desperate situation. Not only did the team need to break contact with the enemy, they now had to carry a seriously wounded teammate while doing so. Through her scope, Maria could see the SEAL team's predicament clearly. They were pinned in a position with minimal cover, taking fire from multiple directions, and unable to move without exposing themselves to even more deadly fire. The Taliban fighters were systematically tightening the noose around them. She acquired another target, this one a rifleman who was providing covering fire for the flanking movement. The range was just over 900 meters, but the target was stationary and clearly visible. Maria made the minute adjustments to her scope and fired again. The second Taliban fighter dropped, but others immediately moved to replace him. The enemy had obviously prepared for this type of engagement and had positioned more fighters than were initially visible. "Overwatch, they're starting to move mortars into position." Morrison's voice carried a new note of urgency. "I can see them setting up what looks like an 82mm mortar about 1,200 meters northwest of the compound." Maria swung her scope to the northwest and found the mortar position. 3 Taliban fighters were working frantically to set up the weapon, while a 4th was preparing ammunition. If they got that mortar operational, the SEAL team's position would become completely untenable. The range to the mortar position was just over 1,200 meters, pushing the limits of effective accuracy for her weapon system, but she had trained extensively at these ranges, and the Taliban fighters around the mortar were relatively stationary targets. She took careful aim at the fighter who appeared to be the team leader directing the mortar setup. The wind was negligible, but she had to account for the increased bullet drop at the extended range. She made the adjustments and steadied herself for the shot. The bullet struck its target, and the mortar team scattered in confusion. But Maria knew they would regroup quickly and try again. She needed to buy the SEAL team time to move, but eliminating individual targets wasn't going to solve the fundamental problem. "Bravo team, can you move to the extraction point if I can suppress the main firing positions?" she asked over the radio. "Negative," came Morrison's immediate response. "Jackson can't walk, and we'd have to cross 800 meters of open ground with no cover. We need a different solution." The extraction point was indeed across open ground that offered no concealment from the enemy positions. Carrying a wounded teammate across that terrain while under fire would be suicide. Maria studied the terrain through her scope, looking for any option that might give the SEAL team a chance. There was a small cluster of buildings about 400 meters northeast of their current position that might offer better cover and defensive positions. But reaching it would still require crossing open ground under fire. "What about the buildings to your northeast?" she suggested. "Better cover and defensive positions than where you are now." "I see them," Morrison replied after a moment. "It's risky, but it might work. Can you provide covering fire during our movement?" "Roger. Give me 60 seconds to reposition for better angles on the enemy positions." Maria began moving again, this time to a position that would allow her to engage multiple enemy positions in rapid succession. The key would be to suppress enough of the enemy fire to give the SEAL team a chance to move with their wounded teammate. As she moved, she could hear the continuing firefight echoing across the valley. The Taliban fighters were maintaining steady pressure on the SEAL team, clearly understanding that time was on their side. Every minute that passed increased the likelihood that more coalition forces would arrive, but it also increased the chances that the pinned Americans would suffer additional casualties. Her new position offered excellent fields of fire across the enemy positions, but it also exposed her to potential return fire. The Taliban fighters would certainly try to locate and eliminate the sniper who had been picking off their teammates. "In position," she reported. "Ready to provide covering fire on your signal." "Roger, moving in 30 seconds. Maria acquired her first target, one of the riflemen who had the best angle on the SEAL team's planned route. She would have to work quickly, engaging multiple targets in rapid succession to create enough suppression to allow the team to move. "Moving now!" Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter. Maria began what would later be described as one of the most impressive displays of precision shooting under combat conditions in the war. In less than 90 seconds, she engaged 6 different enemy positions, forcing the Taliban fighters to take cover just as the SEAL team began their movement toward the buildings. Through her scope, she watched as 8 figures moved across the rocky terrain, one being carried by 2 of his teammates. Enemy fire continued, but it was less accurate and coordinated than before. Her suppressive fire was having the desired effect, but the Taliban fighters were adapting quickly. As the SEAL team neared the buildings, Maria could see enemy fighters beginning to reposition themselves to maintain angles of fire on the new location. The buildings would provide better cover, but they wouldn't solve the fundamental problem of being outnumbered and surrounded. "Made it to the buildings," Morrison reported breathlessly. "Better positions here, but we're still surrounded. How's Jackson?" "Conscious but losing blood," came the response from the team medic. "I've got the bleeding controlled for now, but he needs real medical attention within the next few hours." The tactical situation remained desperate despite the successful movement. The SEAL team now had better cover and defensive positions, but they were still surrounded by a superior enemy force with limited ammunition and a seriously wounded teammate who needed immediate medical evacuation. Maria's radio crackled with an update from Mitchell. "Close air support is still 15 minutes out. Fast rope insertion team is being organized, but won't be ready for at least 45 minutes. 45 minutes might as well have been 45 hours given the current situation. The Taliban fighters were already beginning to reposition around the buildings, and it was only a matter of time before they brought up heavier weapons or additional reinforcements. Through her scope, Maria could see the enemy fighters moving with purpose and coordination. These weren't random insurgents who had stumbled into a firefight. They were well-trained, well-equipped fighters who had planned this ambush carefully and were now executing their plan with military precision. The sound of additional vehicles approaching from the south confirmed her fears. Reinforcements were arriving, and the tactical balance was about to shift even further in favor of the enemy. In the distance, she could see the dust clouds kicked up by at least 3 vehicles moving rapidly toward the compound. "Vehicles approaching from the south," she reported. "Looks like reinforcements. This situation is about to get a lot worse." Morrison's response was grim but determined. "Understood. We'll hold these positions as long as possible. Keep picking them off when you can. Maria knew that holding the positions wasn't really an option. The enemy had too many advantages, and more fighters were arriving every minute. Something dramatic had to happen soon, or the SEAL team was going to be overwhelmed. As she watched the approaching vehicles through her scope, a new plan began to form in her mind. It was dangerous, probably impossible, but it might be the only chance to turn the tactical situation around. The idea was so audacious that she almost dismissed it immediately. But as the sound of enemy vehicles grew louder and the situation continued to deteriorate, Maria realized that sometimes impossible plans were the only ones worth trying. She began calculating ranges, wind conditions, and angles of fire for what would either be the most spectacular shot of her career or her last shot ever. Maria studied the approaching vehicles through her scope, her mind racing through calculations that seemed impossible even to her. The lead vehicle was a Toyota pickup truck with a mounted heavy machine gun, followed by two more trucks carrying additional fighters. They were moving along a winding dirt road that would bring them to the compound in less than 5 minutes. But it wasn't the vehicles themselves that had captured her attention. It was something much more dangerous. Through her scope, she could see that one of the trucks was carrying what appeared to be a recoilless rifle, a weapon capable of destroying the buildings where the SEAL team had taken cover. "Mitchell, are you seeing the weapons on those vehicles?" she called to her spotter. Mitchell adjusted his binoculars toward the approaching convoy. "Jesus, Maria, is that what I think it is?" "Looks like a 107mm recoilless rifle on the second truck. If they get that thing into position, Bravo team is finished." The mathematics of the situation were stark and unforgiving. The buildings that currently provided the SEAL team with life-saving cover would become death traps once that recoilless rifle was in position. The weapon could punch through walls with ease, turning the team's defensive positions into rubble. Maria's scope tracked along the convoy route, studying the terrain and looking for opportunities. The road wound through a narrow valley with steep sides, offering few places where vehicles could turn around or take cover, but it also meant that any shots would be at extreme range with challenging angles. The lead vehicle was now approximately 1,800 meters away and closing fast. Maria had made shots at that distance before, but never under combat conditions, and never with so much depending on the outcome. Her longest confirmed kill in Afghanistan had been at just over 1,400 meters. "Range to the convoy?" she asked Mitchell. 1,800 meters and closing. They'll be at the compound in 4 minutes. 4 minutes to attempt something that most people would consider impossible. Maria's training told her to wait for a closer shot, to engage the vehicles when they reached positions that offered better angles and shorter ranges. But her instincts told her that waiting would be too late. Through her scope, she could see the Taliban fighters in the buildings around the compound beginning to position themselves for a coordinated assault once the heavy weapons arrived. They had been content to pin down the SEAL team while they waited for reinforcements, but now they were preparing for the final phase of their ambush. "Bravo team, you've got heavy weapons approaching fast," she reported over the radio. "I count at least one recoilless rifle. Your current positions won't provide protection against that kind of firepower." Morrison's response was immediate and tense. "Can you engage the convoy?" Maria stared through her scope at the distant vehicles, calculating wind drift, bullet drop, and the dozens of other factors that would affect a shot at this extreme range. The morning wind was picking up, adding another variable to an already impossible equation. "Range is extreme," she replied honestly, "but I don't think we have any other options." She began the careful process of adjusting her scope for the long-distance shot. The Barrett M107 was capable of reaching targets at this range, but accuracy became increasingly difficult as distance increased. At 1,800 meters, she would have to account for significant bullet drop and wind drift. "What's the wind call?" she asked Mitchell. Her spotter studied the terrain between their position and the convoy, looking for indicators of wind speed and direction, dust patterns, vegetation movement, and even the heat shimmer from the sun-warmed ground could provide clues about wind conditions. "I'm seeing 3 to 5 miles per hour from the southwest," Mitchell reported. "But it's variable. Could be gusting higher in the valley where the convoy is moving." Variable wind conditions made the shot even more challenging. A gust of wind at the wrong moment could push the bullet several feet off target at this range. Maria would have to time her shot carefully and hope for the best. Through her scope, she focused on the lead vehicle with the mounted machine gun. Taking out the heavy weapons had to be her priority, even if it meant letting the other vehicles reach the compound. She began tracking the vehicle, learning its movement pattern and speed. The Toyota was moving at approximately 40 miles per hour along the winding dirt road. At that speed, Maria would have to lead the target significantly to account for the time it took the bullet to travel 1,800 meters. She estimated the bullet's flight time at just over 2 seconds. "I'm going for the machine gun truck first," she announced. "If I can take out their heavy weapons, it might buy us some time." Maria settled into her shooting position, controlling her breathing and finding her natural respiratory pause. Through her scope, she watched the lead vehicle navigate a particularly sharp curve in the road. In a few seconds, it would emerge onto a straighter section where she might have a better shot. The truck rounded the curve and accelerated onto the straight section of road. Maria led the target, accounting for its speed and direction, and squeezed the trigger. The Barrett's powerful recoil slammed against her shoulder as the massive .50 caliber bullet began its journey across the valley. Through her scope, she watched as the truck continued moving for what seemed like an eternity. Then, suddenly, the windshield exploded in a shower of glass and the vehicle swerved violently off the road, rolling down a steep embankment. "Hit!" Mitchell called out excitedly. "The lead truck is down!" But Maria was already shifting her aim to the second vehicle, the one carrying the recoilless rifle. This truck had immediately stopped when the lead vehicle was hit, and the driver was frantically trying to turn around on the narrow road. The temporary halt actually made for an easier shot, but it also meant the crew might be preparing to deploy their weapon right where they were. She could see figures jumping out of the truck and beginning to maneuver the heavy weapon into firing position. If they succeeded in setting up the recoilless rifle, they could engage the SEAL team from their current position without having to advance any closer. "They're setting up the heavy weapon," Mitchell observed. "You need to take that shot now." Maria adjusted her aim point to target the weapon itself rather than the truck. If she could disable or destroy the recoilless rifle, it would eliminate the immediate threat to the SEAL team regardless of what happened to the crew. The weapon was being positioned on a small rise beside the road, offering the crew better angles on the compound below, but it also made them more visible to Maria's position on the ridge. The range was still extreme, but the target was stationary now. She made final adjustments to her scope, accounting for the changed range and angles. The recoilless rifle crew was working frantically to get their weapon operational, understanding that they were exposed to sniper fire, but racing to complete their setup before they could be engaged. Maria found her breathing rhythm again and settled her crosshairs on the weapon's barrel assembly. If she could hit the barrel or the sight system, it would render the weapon useless even if she didn't kill the crew members. The shot broke cleanly, and Maria immediately began tracking the bullet's path through her scope. At this extreme range, she could actually see the bullet's vapor trail as it crossed the valley. After what seemed like an eternity, she saw the impact. The recoilless rifle barrel bent at an impossible angle, and the crew scattered in all directions. Secondary explosions from the weapon's ammunition suggested that her bullet had done more than just damage the barrel. "Recoilless rifle is down," Mitchell reported with obvious excitement. "That was an incredible shot." But Maria was already looking for the third vehicle. It had managed to turn around and was now retreating rapidly back the way it had come. Without the heavy weapons, the enemy reinforcements were no longer an immediate threat to overrun the SEAL team's positions. The tactical situation had changed dramatically in the space of 2 shots. The Taliban fighters around the compound were still in position, but they no longer had the overwhelming firepower advantage they had been counting on. More importantly, the SEAL team's defensive positions were no longer under threat from heavy weapons. "Bravo, team. Heavy weapons are neutralized," Maria reported, "but you're still surrounded by riflemen." "Roger that, Overwatch. Outstanding shooting. We can hold these positions against small arms fire until the cavalry arrives." The radio chatter was interrupted by the distant sound of helicopter rotors. The close air support that had been requested was finally arriving. Two AH-64 Apache attack helicopters appeared on the horizon, moving fast toward the valley. Maria's radio crackled with communications between the helicopter pilots and the ground team. Within minutes, the Apaches were engaging the Taliban positions around the compound with precision rocket strikes and 30mm cannon fire. The enemy fighters who had planned such a careful ambush found themselves on the receiving end of overwhelming firepower. Those who could retreat quickly melted away into the surrounding terrain. Others who were caught in fixed positions were systematically destroyed by the attack helicopters. "Overwatch, this is Apache Lead. We've got you visual on the ridge. Thanks for marking targets for us. That was some impressive shooting." Maria felt a surge of pride at the recognition from the helicopter pilots, but she was more focused on the SEAL team's status. "Bravo, team, what's your situation?" "All secure here," Morrison responded. "Jackson's stable, and we've got a clear route to the extraction point now. Medevac helicopter is inbound for immediate casualty evacuation." The sound of additional helicopters filled the valley as a complete rescue package arrived. Medical evacuation helicopters, additional attack helicopters for security, and transport helicopters for the SEAL team created a temporary airfield in the desert below. Within 30 minutes, the entire team had been extracted from the valley. Petty Officer Jackson was loaded onto a medical helicopter and flown directly to a surgical facility where he would make a complete recovery. The rest of the SEAL team was returned to their base for debriefing and preparation for their next mission. Maria and Mitchell remained in position until all friendly forces had cleared the area. Only then did they begin the careful process of packing their equipment and preparing for their own extraction. The Barrett rifle that had made those impossible shots was carefully cleaned and secured for the helicopter ride back to base. As they waited for their extraction helicopter, Mitchell shook his head in amazement. "Maria, I've been spotting for snipers for 6 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did today. Those shots are going to become legend." Maria smiled as she looked out across the valley, where 8 American warriors had almost died, but were now safe because of 2 precisely placed bullets. Sometimes you just have to take the shot and trust your training. The extraction helicopter arrived as the sun was setting over the Afghan mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. As they lifted off from the ridge where she had spent one of the most intense days of her military career, Maria reflected on the events that had brought her to this moment. The little girl from Texas who had learned to shoot with her father could never have imagined that her skills would one day save the lives of Navy SEALs in the mountains of Afghanistan. But that's exactly what had happened, and the impossible shots she made that day would indeed become the stuff of military legend. 6 months later, Maria Santos would receive the Silver Star for her actions that day, becoming one of the few female snipers to be so honored. But the real reward had come the moment she heard Morrison's voice on the radio saying, "All secure here." 8 American soldiers had gone home to their families, and that was worth more than any medal could ever be. The war in Afghanistan would continue for several more years, and Maria would serve 2 more deployments before finally returning home to Texas. But she would never again be called upon to make shots as challenging or as crucial as the ones she made that morning in the valley, where a carefully planned Taliban ambush was turned into a disaster by the skill and courage of a young woman with a rifle. The extreme-range shots that saved Bravo Team became a case study taught in sniper schools for years afterward. Students would learn about wind calculations, range estimation, and target tracking through the lens of Maria's actions that day. But the most important lesson was one that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Sometimes the impossible shot is the only one worth taking.